Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu. You're welcome to this episode of Sharia Intelligence, where today we will be looking at an interesting topic, carrying on from where we stopped yesterday, looking at the legislative implications of the Sunnah and how to distinguish the Sunnah from the Seerah. Today we will be focusing particularly on the work of a very respected scholar and a jurist, Ibn Ashur, who classified the legislative intent, or what you call the roles the Prophet ﷺ played, into 12 categories. But before we go in, I would like to introduce our colleagues and discussants, some of our top facilitators with the Dawah Institute, Brother Nasir Bello and Brother Ibrahim Bello. You're both most welcome.
Thank you very much.
The first question I'd like to address to you, Malam Ibrahim, or starting with you. Why is it important to understand the context of a hadith? The context in which something was said. How is that relevant to the legislative implication or the level of certainty we have regarding the implication of a hadith?
Yeah, legislative implication or context are very important because they give you the background of why. It's more like the historical context surrounding it. Like with the Quran, there are many verses of Quran you understand nearly nothing if you don't dig in to know why.
The sababun
nuzul. Now with hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, they are called sababul wurud. You have them too. Because it's just not possible to say texts as important as hadith that were dictated or were reports of actions 1,400 years ago will be relevant today in our practical application if we don't know their context. Usually they will tell you a text without context is pretext to be biased. And most of the time, people confuse information just because they don't know the context surrounding it. So this whole idea of knowing the legislative implication or what was actually the rule or the capacity or the why, let me use that word, behind each statement of the Prophet is very, very important in understanding a hadith and their implications to our practical life today.
Excellent. So to understand the Sunnah better, it is important to be certain your understanding is correct. It is absolutely imperative to understand the context in which it was said. What would you add to this, Brother Nasir?
One very interesting comment or statement that I consider very relevant to this issue of context and the role it plays in trying to understand the Sunnah is that very popular statement of Ibn Abi Layla that you don't understand the Sunnah until you are able to differentiate what to pick from it and what to leave. And context plays a significant role in effective interpretation of the Sunnah, and it equally helps in reducing speculation, resolving or even avoiding conflict and contradiction, what they call ta'arud. It also helps in preventing a wrong assumption with the text. It helps in resolving, in avoiding pretext and even abuse of intent of the particular text. So basically, it plays a significant role in understanding how to situate the text, how to make sense of the meaning amidst probably other things, and resolving it with other probably apparently contradicting texts or evidences that you might find.
Ibn Ashur, in his treatise on Maqasid Shariah, the higher intents of Shariah, discusses 12 prophetic intents, as he put it, or 12 legislative implications, 12 roles that the Prophet played that allow us and that provide a context to the statements and actions of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Could you, Malam Nasir, help us with an overview of these 12 prophetic intents on his actions, or 12 roles the Prophet ﷺ played? What are these? And could you start maybe introducing one or two of them? I'd like us to look at a few. We'll not look at each and every one of them, but at least let's have a list of those 12, and let's start discussing with some examples.
The idea of trying to classify or understand the intents of Rasulullah when it comes to the prophetic tradition has a very long history. You will find a lot of scholars making effort to come up with different classifications. Some will classify them according to 3 classes, some 4, some 7. But one of the most comprehensive ones available is that of Ibn Ashur. Ibn Ashur is one of the contemporary scholars that died recently. He attempts in his book to classify the hadith or the sunnah of Rasulullah based on 12 categories. And these 12 classes or classification, this classification of his is equally based on 2 broad categories. That is the category of tashri', those that are legislative, and ghayru tashri', and those that are not legislative. So under them, you have him looking at intents of Prophet ﷺ with regard to the sunnah of the Prophet. The first one is the intent of Rasulullah ﷺ, legislative intent, that is as a legislator, where you have lot of examples around that. You would find another example where Rasulullah ﷺ is issuing verdict, is giving a fatwa. Another good one is actually where Rasulullah ﷺ acted in his capacity as a judge. In another example, you would find other series of examples. You would find a situation where Rasulullah ﷺ acted in his capacity as a political leader. So the intent is a political leader. It could be a policy that he is making as a political leader. In some situations, Rasulullah ﷺ acted in his capacity as an advisor, just trying to give an advice. Some situations will be trying to reconcile, trying to do sulhu between 2 people that are having issues. Sometimes it will be counseling. Sometimes you would find Rasulullah ﷺ acting in his capacity as a mentor, as trying to discipline his companions. And there are other categories where Rasulullah ﷺ acted as just an ordinary human being that was raised, that was born and raised in a certain culture. So they are clearly non-tashri' situations, behavior of a human being that is, that lives within a particular culture, which has nothing to do with what to emulate as a Muslim. So these are some of the examples you would find. And now if you come back to the first intents of legislation, you would see a lot from the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, particularly those aspects that constitute the fundamentals of the religion, what we call ma'lum min ad-dini bid-darura, issues around salat, issues around, you find hadith like sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli, you should pray the way you see me praying. Khudhu anni manasikakum, you should learn from me how to practice Hajj, and many other examples that you would find around these fundamentals. Again, some of the examples of legislation are things around obligations and prohibitions, where Rasulullah will say it is prohibited for you to do certain kind of things. Hadith around slander, for example, backbiting. When Rasulullah talks about the issue of ghiba, for example, he asked his companions, do you know what ghiba is? And he said, saying bad about your brother on some things he wouldn't like. And many other examples where clearly it is prohibition. Or examples where Rasulullah made something obligatory. And there are a lot of examples around that where Rasulullah made a law or a legislation that is obligating Muslims to do certain things. So these are some of the examples you find under that particular intent. Allahu Ta'ala alam.
This is very interesting. So what you have given us is where the Prophet is acting as a prophet, as a messenger of Allah who we emulate, and one would assume, therefore, when he speaks in his capacity as a prophet, he is speaking from the background of wahi,
Yes.
of guidance from Allah. And this is something we all have to take as followers of the last prophet. Alam Ibrahim, could you elaborate further? Alam Ibrahim, Alam Nasir mentioned the various roles the Prophet ﷺ played. Probably Ibn Ashur deliberately did not add some of those things the Prophet did that nobody is expected to emulate, in that they were just unique to him. But looking at these roles of Ibn Ashur, how about we look at his role as a mufti in the area of giving fatwa, as a judge, and as a political leader? Could you give us some examples and elaborate on each of these, please?
Now, just to add, and like you say, some of the things he did, much of the things he did actually as a prophet constitute bulk of it. But of course, there are great amount of like those things he did even as a prophet, but on different capacities. So one of it is as a mufti. Mufti means somebody that issues religious verdicts. Usually the essence of verdict or fatwa is to provide a way out of a problem and to ease a situation of somebody that is confused, somebody seeking to know the validity of his action, which he might not necessarily go back to correct, or is faced with a situation that require, because of a specific context, a change in the ruling. So the Prophet actually acted in this capacity. The popular example is during the Hajjat al-Wada, on the 10th day of Hajj, which we call Yawm al-Hajj al-Akbar. There are a number of rites that are like 5, all of which have to be fulfilled that day. So Sahabas came to him because of the number and how tight the schedule that day was. They confused the order. And nearly everybody coming to him to seek his opinion, Ya Rasulallah, I didn't know. I shaved before coming to throw stones. The Prophet will say, La haraj. Others will say, no, I did my tawaf, circumambulation, before doing the sacrifice, which is among all these are the rites. Nearly no single question somebody asked regarding the order of things that day that the Prophet ﷺ did not validate.
Now there was no problem.
No problem. So that is fatwa. So the Prophet served this role also. Sometimes people come to him with their specific problem, seeking, what do I do? And like I say, fatwa is more specific to context. Two people might have different context. So a man came to Rasulullah asking whether he's kissing his wife during Ramadan will spoil his fast. The Prophet said, no, you're fine. Because the Prophet looked at that person as a little elderly. Another one, the Prophet said, no, you cannot do it. So these kind of things are called fatwa. So the Prophet served that rule.
So it's the same question.
Yeah, but different
because
answer.
Different person, different consequences.
Context,
probably.
exactly. So you also have, as a judge, you have cases where people have a dispute over a land and the Prophet ruled over it. And usually being a judge means you must know the reality, you must know the context, you must have heard the two sides of the story before you take a position. So whatever ruling issued that time, it's not universal. And you only take similar position or assume that position only if you are a judge. And a number of cases too, the Prophet had that. He ruled between this lady that wanted to separate with her wife. What's the name? The wife of Qais. The wife. Now, this is judge. When the lady insisted, the Prophet ruled, could you give back what he has given you, his farm? And she said yes. She gave, and the Prophet separated the marriage. Kholo, Now you also have roles of political leader. Sometimes the Prophet will call for people to participate in a war. You don't declare a war if you are not a leader. Or sometimes he will rule that henceforth do not eat domestic donkeys Because they were means of transport, so he ruled they are prohibited. Sometimes he will declare that whosoever kills an enemy with an evidence, then the armor of the enemy belongs to him. Or whosoever cultivates a barren land, and a number of these kind of rulings. That we just need to go back to history and see why did the Prophet say that. As a political leader, he appointed governors, he appointed ambassadors, he does this and that. So all this you need to really know in what capacity did the Prophet actually did them. And if you are not in that capacity, you don't take those statements to be of general application, or you don't assume that position. You might be creating unnecessary bottlenecks or problems to the Muslim and to the understanding of the text.
This is very interesting. So what you're saying is there are those things the Prophet said in his capacity as a prophet. And if you're not a prophet, you don't speak in that capacity. And if the last prophet has come and gone, you can't change those rulings. So when the Prophet says, pray as you see me pray, that one you pray as the Prophet ﷺ prayed. When, however, the Prophet spoke in his capacity as a political leader, assigning, who is to be governor of this place, who's to be, who do we have treaties with, when do we declare war, when do we, make those type of state decisions. If you are not the political leader, you don't say the Prophet said or the Prophet did, and therefore I have the authority. You have to be in that position. If you, as you gave also example of a mufti, where the Prophet would decide based on the case at hand. And usually, I guess, as a mufti, he is doing his ijtihad, and sometimes it is giving what is wahi. And so we find the Prophet doing qiyas, reasoning by analogy, when it comes to issuing some of his verdicts. A woman asking, should I pay back my fasting? And the Prophet asked, my father's hajj, or, and the Prophet using qiyas analogy, if it was a debt, would you be required to pay? And the discussions around that. So really important that if you are not a judge, you don't take hadith where the Prophet implemented the punishment on alcohol drinking, and you say, well, it's in the Quran and it's in the Sunnah, so if I catch a person who has taken alcohol, I can implement. That is only implementable by a judge. You don't say because it is in the Sunnah that you can just copy and paste and implement. Malam Nasir, could you give us more roles of the Prophet ﷺ in his other capacities, such as sulhu or advice? What would you add to this?
Well, as you rightly mentioned, the whole idea, I think, for Ibn Ashur is to look at Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It is obvious from the Quran and many ahadith that Muslims are encouraged and even commanded to emulate Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But then what he tried to do is to look at, just like every other human being, you have your roles, you have your responsibilities, and to a large extent they are context specific, they are specific to individuals. And so also Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he has different set of roles, different responsibilities, and that will guide Muslims to understand how, in what context that I am living in, I can emulate Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What are the things to learn, and what are my limitations regarding emulating Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Now, coming to some of the other examples, capacities he identified, this issue of trying to reconcile between two parties or even more. That is the idea of sulhu. A good example of that is the case of Barira and her husband Mughis, where the husband so much loved his wife, and he came to Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam asking him to intercede on his behalf for her to come back to the marriage. But Barira doesn't like the marriage, and she has made her decision. So Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked her to consider going back to the husband, and she said, Ya Rasulullah, is it a command or just an advice? He said, no, I'm just trying to resolve between the two of you, so I'm just advising. You have the liberty to decide. She said, okay, if that is the case, I choose not to go back. So that is an example of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam trying to reconcile between two camps or two people trying to do sulhu. Another example of this kind is when some people, some companions that were indebted, reach out to Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam asking to intervene to, on their behalf, ask those that they owe to actually forgive or to waive some of the debts they are owing them. And when Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam invited those who are actually owing those people, they refused to come because they know why Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam invited them. And Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not feel bad about it because the whole idea is they know what Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam will ask of them and they don't want to do it.
So
and
the creditors, they didn't want to forgive the debt.
Exactly,
but
exactly.
Even though the Prophet invited them, they still, had the choice not to.
Exactly, they had the choice. Why? Because that is in his capacity as a leader that is trying to mediate between two parties. That is an attempt to do sulhu, and that give them the liberty or the choice to even come or not to come. This, considering the fact that they know the purpose of the invitation. Now, another good example is Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam acting in his capacity as an advisor. And you find many ahadith of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam around that. For example, when somebody asks Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, advise me, or give me what he calls wasiyah, which is literally advice, seeking for advice. He said, don't be angry, la taghdab. And he asked on several occasions, then advise me, he said, don't be angry. So this is an example of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam trying to advise. Another example of such is when Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam advised one of the companions that he shouldn't seek for any political leadership. I think it's Abu Dhar, because he said, because you are weak. So this is another example. Another good example is the case of Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas. Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, when he was about dying, he said to Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam that I am so rich and I have only my daughter that will inherit from me. Don't you think it would be good if I decided to take 2/3 of my wealth and give it fi sabilillah? Then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to him, but 2/3 is so much. He said, okay, what about a half? He said, it's still much. He said, what about 1/3? He said, well, wasulthu kathir aw kabir. That even that one is also big, is also much. But remember, leaving your daughter or the person that is going to inherit you wealthy and affluent is much better than you allow them or leave them seeking and begging other people. He said, innaka an tadhara warathataka aghniya khayrun min an tadharahum alatan yatakhaffafuna an-nas. That leaving them wealthy is better than allowing them to be beggars and asking for people to give them, to help them. So this is an advice Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave. Another good example is the advice Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave to some companions, that instead of saying you are going to be fasting all through, why not do Sawm Dawood, which is yasumu yawman wa yufṭir yawman. He fasts for a day and he breaks for another day. So these are some of the examples of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam trying to advise companions on what to do. And this is just as an advisor. Another good example that was actually presented by Ibn Ashur is Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam acting in his capacity as a mentor, trying to give, discipline his companions. And you would find many examples of hadith where Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam will say, you will not believe until you do this. La yu'minu ahadukum hatta yuhibba li akhihi ma yuhibbu li nafsihi. One of you will not believe until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. One, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يكون كذا 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 حتى يكون هواه تابعا لما جئت به. لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى and many of these examples of لا يؤمن أحدكم that you would find. Another good example of this, Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the hadith where Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam was talking about the importance of congregational prayer. He said, I feel sometimes like going to the houses of those that are not actually coming for prayer and burning the houses because they refuse to. So these are things around discipline. These are sort of exaggeration for them to understand the benefit or the value of what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is trying to admonish them to. Another good example is this issue of the kind of clothes we wear. And you have this hadith where Rasulullah talk about pride, talk about arrogance, as it relates to the kind of cloth we wear. إزرة المؤمن إلى أنصاب ساقيه فلا جناح عليه فيما بينه وبين الكعبين ما أسفل من الكعبين ففي النار من جر إزاره بطرا من جر إزاره خيلا فهو في النار. This issue of the clothes of a woman does not exceed his ankles. Whatever gets beyond that is in nar. Whoever did that with arrogance, Allah will not forgive him. And this kind of a hadith that you will find, which is trying to admonish Muslims to be very humble, to be modest in the way they dress and the way they behave. The last example, of course, is that which is non-instructional. This kind of things that are perhaps part of, to some extent, influenced by the culture and the context within which the Prophet found himself. These things around the way he made choices about normal, mundane, day-to-day activities. Things like wearing turban, for example. Things like eating pumpkin, for example, that you would find Rasulullah eating. Issues around riding animals, issues around the path he followed in going to Mecca, for example, and where he rested, that you would find some of the books of Sirah highlighting every detail of it. These are some of the examples of non-instructional things around the Sunnah of Rasulullah that actually was highlighted by Ibn Ashur. Allahu
A'lam. You've mentioned and you've given a lot of examples, and we're not giving everything, but just an introduction to the subject area of these where there's wisdom behind certain pieces of advice that's being given, but also the need to understand those that were non-instructional. Are there any further examples of this, Madam Ibrahim, that you could give?
For non-instructional, sometimes you look at the nature of dress and clothing he wore then, the variety of food he ate, the agricultural system then, most of these things, including the ride. The Prophet rode on a donkey, he rode on a camel, sometimes a horse. It will not be considered sunnah to say we must ride on a horse. These ones were just context that dictated that. Okay? Sahabas trek along with him to Hajj. And sometimes he would take a nap before Raka'at al-Fajr or after Raka'at al-Fajr. Okay? These ones are non-instructional. So people should understand them in that context. Also, when he was talking of ta'adib, discipline, usually is overemphasis. Try to overemphasize some things so that people will take you more serious.
Like hyperbole.
Hyperbole.
Yeah.
You said, Wallahi la yu'min, Wallahi la yu'min, Wallahi la yu'min. He swore 3 times that I call God to witness that person is not a true believer. And Sahaba's like, okay, they now pay attention. Man ya Rasulallah. He said, Man la ya'manu jaruhu bawaika. Whosoever is not enemy does not feel safe from his harm. How serious is that? So you have these kind of instances. That is the prophetic way. He also gave example of, advice. Usually when you want to advise people to be great, to do some things that are extra meritorious, it will involve denying them or advising them to avoid things that ordinarily were permissible. A group came to him one day, they were Jew or Christians. A group of Christian scholars came to him, and when they related to him their beliefs and faith in Isa and about hereafter, and nearly everything seems so in line with the prophetic teaching of Islam, and they are now coming to accept Islam. But they say, ordinarily before now, this is our belief. The Prophet praised them. He said, Innakum fukaha ulama kittum antakunu anbiya. You are great scholars. In fact, you are just a step to becoming prophets of God. But then what is interesting is what he advised them. He said, Im kuntum kama taqulun, fala tajma'u ma la ta'kulun, wa la tabnu ma la taskunun. If truly you are what you presented yourself to be, then avoid piling up material things that you don't need. But it's not haram to have things you don't need. You can have big bank accounts. He said, وَلَا تَبْنُوا مَا لَا تَسْكُنُونَ. Don't build houses you will not live in. So these kind of things are like you advising somebody to be extra meritorious, to be virtuous, exactly. Wara, that kind of a thing. So the Prophet has all these kind of things, and sometimes including his wives. He discouraged, he prohibited men from using gold, but did not prohibit other women. But his own wives, family members, he told them, do not. That should not be misunderstood to mean it is prohibited for women to wear gold. So these are various instances and the intricacies of trying to get these things clearer so that we don't misinterpret or misrepresent him in the name of trying to emulate him.
This is really interesting, and I'd like you to say more as we come to the end of this discussion on the implications of this classification of Ibn Ashur and other scholars to the legislative implication, the certainty around legislative implications. In other words, why is this important? Because I think we need to stress this is not for the sake of not following the Sunnah, but actually being more certain that we follow what the Prophet intended we follow.
Yeah, I think let's just start by the statement of Ibn Abi Layla, a great Tabi'i scholar, that a man does not understand Sunnah until he knows what to take and what not to. So, it means part of the Sunnah, there are things that you can adopt, you can take that are relevant. And there are those that are not relevant to your situation. Or probably they were just historical. غير تشريعي. So suffice to say that Sunnah broadly classified into Tashri' and Gairu Tashri'. Whatever part of Sunnah is Tashri' is binding upon us to follow. Of course, the level of the liability will depend on whether it is Farud or Wajib. But then we are calling our people to be very, very careful, because understanding these rules help us in getting to having it its greater certainty. Yeah, you just have to get it clearer now. And yeah, okay. Certainty particularly when it relates to meaning now and implications. Not historical authenticity, that's a separate subject. But this issue of context is trying to just get it clearer. What exactly does it mean? Yeah, we're sure the Prophet said it. But are we sure this is what he meant? That's only possible when we know context. Also, to be very careful of rushing to conclude on issues that are non-conclusive, meaning there are possibilities of having more than one implication or interpretation, either because of changing context or because of the nature of the instruction. And like Quran, Sababun Nuzul is a requirement before you can interpret any verse of Quran. You can be a professor of Arabic, you can be anything. You just cannot understand many things in Quran. You can't get it clear. You can't correlate if you don't have Sababun Nuzul. Same thing with Hadith.
That is the knowledge of the context.
Yes.
The historical context.
Yes.
That is also important.
And because scholars know this, that is why earlier on in the past, hundreds of years ago, people like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, Ibn Abdul Barr, earlier, student of Imam Malik, they wrote commentary to these compendiums of hadith. Why? Taking the hadith alone might be devoid of context. So you have At-Tamheed, Lima fil Muwatta'i min al-Fiqh wal-Asanid by Ibn Abdul Barr, a great student of Imam Malik, voluminous book, all trying to give you detailed commentary on the meaning, implication, the context surrounding all the ahadith in Muwatta. Later on you have Hafiz Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani writing Fathul Bari. Volumes of book, like 15 or so, on the commentary. You also have Irshadus Sari, like more than one commentaries on Sahih al-Bukhari. You have Imam al-Nawawi write Al-Minhaj. You have Nailul Awtari. Most of these scholars, what were they trying to do? They give you the context, they give you the history. Now this is why, now this is why. So these are very important, and for us to be very careful. Also, we should be humble and respect scholarship. Where are scholars coming from? That as much as you want to copy the Sunnah, if you really want to be closer to the Sunnah, then you need to study beyond just the text. You need to get a broader picture of all the ahadith, like one scholar ever asserted, that the number of ahadith available altogether probably will not be more than 15,000. But because they have various versions, that if brought together will aid you see a bigger context, that's why you have more than 40,000 riwayat and what have you. So these are very important, and we need to be very, very cautious and careful in the way we interpret and deal with ordinary text of hadith.
Excellent. Alan Nasser, what would you add to this?
Well, I think this issue of context and its implication plays a significant role in trying to resolve and reduce the danger of generalizing what is actually specific and vice versa. And it equally helps in trying to reduce the danger of presuming dhanni as qat'i, and of course vice versa also. Another role or another implication it has is it helps in resolving or addressing the readings of individual biases, or even the implication of cognitive cultural biases in the reading of the text. One final point or role it plays actually is it helps in supporting the idea of al-jam, which is actually conciliation or harmonization of apparently contradicting text or hadith over the idea of prioritization, that is tarjih, or even cancellation of certain hadith that appear contradicting. So these are some of the important things around the idea of appreciating the role of context and its implication in reading and understanding the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Well, thank you very much both for this elaboration on the subject of how scholars reclassified hadith when it came to their implication. So you've got those scholars of hadith who look at the hadith and classify them according to authenticity. And after you've brought a hadith to the table and you say this is sahih, you find another group of scholars wanting a higher degree of certainty. And there you find fuqaha looking at the hadith again and looking at how many chains and discussing this as mutawatir, where we have more absolute or close to absolute certainty about, and those where there is presumption and a level of doubt, however small. Then you've got those scholars who, after agreeing that these are all usable hadith, when it comes to the dilala, in other words, not the authenticity and is it reliable and how certain are we about the reliability, when it comes to using the hadith to now distinguish between seerah and sunnah, what is just of historical relevance, to looking at those things that we have things to learn from, that we are prescribed, and even in the sunnah of what the Prophet did, what he approved of, what others did that he approved of, we find another classification and looking at, yeah, this one there's something to learn, but it is not binding, and those things that they are binding, and this various roles the Prophet ﷺ played, and how knowledge of the context of the hadith allows us to know which one is tashri', which one has legislative implications that it's going to be used to tell you this is haram or fard or mustahab or mubah, etc., and which are those that do not have legislative implications but still help us see the wisdom and the illah behind why the Prophet did certain things. And as the scholars say, al-hukum yadur bi ma'il illah wujudan aw adaman, that a ruling goes with its reason. And when you see the Prophet do something, the study of the context helps you know why it was done. And as Imam Shatibi also said, when it comes to mu'amalat and these actions, what is critical is to look at the maqasid. In other words, look at why it was done, get the wisdom behind it so that you don't misapply in the name of sincerity. The need to really follow the sunnah as the sunnah is meant to be followed, following the footsteps of the great companions of the Prophet ﷺ, who were following the guidance of the Prophet, who made it clear to them those things that were to be followed and were not, and they understood that very well. We will inshallah come to the end, not just of this session, but this particular session marks the end of the second part of the Usulul Fiqh segment of this course. The next would be to go to the third, which is looking at the Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya, the Islamic legal maxims, which we will come to inshallah next time. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for all you have shared with us. Jazakumullahu khairan. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.